Hello guys, this is your friend Naruto Fanfictions and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Mikoto gives eternal Mangekyou Sharingan to Naruto Harem Part 2. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. Pulling weeds. I vanished in a swirl. A moment later, I appeared right outside the Uchiha police force headquarters. It was an unsightly building in more than one regard. If I were to name the one thing that upset me the most, it would be the usage of the Uchiha clan symbol as part of the police force symbol. My grandfather and father had made a monumental mistake in allowing the clan to be openly tied to the police force, resulting in many believing our clan and the police force to be one and the same. This widened the divide, and was the root cause for many of our problems. People didn't like others policing them, and they liked it even less when it was lorded over them. Apparently, the Uchiha pride, which many of my kin seemed to have been born with, didn't allow for anything else. This created lasting resentment, and it certainly didn't help matters that the police force wasn't partial to wearing a mask like Anbu to protect their identities. With a smirk, I stepped into the building. At least severing those ties would help me release some stress. It had been some time since I had let loose, and straw dummies were a poor substitute for the smell of blood, the sound of breaking bones, and the sight of life leaving an enemy's eyes. Mikoto-sama, I was greeted by the Chunin, manning the large reception desk in the middle of the lobby. He served as a gatekeeper to the rest of the building through the corridors behind it. It's a pleasure to see you. How may I be of service? His name was Junichiro. He was a pleasant enough man. Eager to please, married, one kid, a 2-year-old girl by the name of Ryoko. He was the embodiment of what was wrong with our clan, by deciding to stagnate for the last 12 years. He solely relied on his eyes to get him through the drunken brawls his superiors sent him to stop instead of trying to become the best version of himself. I was convinced that anyone born with the advantages our heritage provided should be able to get themselves at least rated as an A-rank shinobi in the bingo books. At the end of the day, it wasn't that hard to do. Shuffling closer to him as quickly as my outfit permitted, I arrived at the front desk. Giving him an alluring smile, one that I didn't even have to fake at the prospect of never again having to call Fugaku anything other than his name, I asked, I am looking for my husband. He has not come home yet. It had the intended effect of lowering his guard, which was nearly non-existent to begin with. Just a moment, he declared. The instant he took his eyes off me and looked down upon what I assumed was a list outside my field of vision, I struck. My hand darted forward faster than a normal eye could track and closed around his mouth, keeping him from making a sound, thus allowing for the senbon held between my index and middle finger to break his skin and flood his veins with toxins, which started to do their work. In one moment, his eyes widened when he realized what was going on, only for him to slump against my arm the next. Without him resisting, it was simple to flip him over the desk. He landed on his back, the dull thud accompanied by a faint grunt, the only sound that could be heard. Reaching into my kimono, I took out one of the chakra suppression and paralyzing seals and tagged him with one on his forehead. Secured that way, I made him disappear with Kamui. The poison saturated in my senbons was incredibly fast-acting, but its effect was by no means instantaneous. Not that this would have changed the ultimate outcome if he would have managed to alarm his comrades. Given the state our clan was in, fighting 2, 20, or 100 wouldn't make much of a difference. The reason I still relied on subterfuge to take them out was simple. Having to hunt down kinsmen fleeing in all directions was not my definition of fun, especially not while wearing a kimono, and they would flee were they to witness me taking down a dozen of their comrades without a single scratch. So, taking them out in small groups was definitely less of a headache. I walked around the desk and flipped through the duty roster. 26 on site and 12 two-man teams on patrol in the village, 50 altogether, so quite manageable. Fortunately, none of the teams was supposed to be back for another half hour, as their shifts were staggered to ensure there was always a police presence on the streets. After some rumination, I decided to go through the station one room at a time. In order to do so, I created 3 additional shadow clones, reducing the chakra at my disposal even further. The clones' help would save some time, allowing me to send one of me down each corridor. A quick henge later, we all assumed the likeliness of Junkiro. It wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. The Sharingan could effortlessly penetrate this academy-ranked jutsu. This was one of the reasons given, besides it being a good lie detector, that it had to be us who policed the village. For the Sharingan to matter, they would need to look at me with it activated. To the best of my knowledge, there was a standing order in place to flash your Sharingan at everyone approaching you that you had lost sight of for more than a moment in order to prevent the exact scenario I was about to implement. So, in theory, my approach shouldn't work. Then again, people grew complacent, doubly so when away from the battlefield, and if the Uchiha clan under Fugaku's leadership had become anything in spades, it was complacent. Walking down the corridor, I reached the first office. The door was slightly ajar, and the sound of a dipped pen scraping on paper could be heard. Without pause, I opened the door and stepped inside. 2 heads bent forward over their work turned my way, neither bothering with activating their Sharingan, reinforcing my decision not to rely on a stealthy approach. With the room only having 2 small windows and only one other way in, getting discovered at some point sneaking down the hallways was a foregone conclusion. "What is it?" one of them asked, irritated at his work being interrupted, the smile on the face of the person I pretended to be, not deterring the harsh response to my presence in the slightest. Not that it mattered, as 2 senbon sank into the neck of the chunin in the room the next instant. A surprised, "What?" escaped the throat of the one who had addressed me as he slumped over in his seat. His female partner managed to close one hand around the senbon as she sprung from her seat. The other hand went to the kunai holster around her thigh, never getting there. Her hand stopped halfway as vertigo hit her, and she fell down onto the floor. I remained standing in the doorframe, keeping an eye on the corridor in case anyone had overheard something and came to investigate. After waiting a few seconds in which I intently listened and heard nothing to that effect, I fully entered the room, tagged them, and transported them to the rest. Back in the corridor, I made my way to the next room when a door further down opened, and someone stepped out. The man was balancing more than a dozen scrolls stacked on his arm, nearly impeding his vision. He walked towards me, most likely headed for the archives. A short nod my way was the only recognition I received. I waited for him to pass me by when my hand struck sideways and put a senbon into his neck. Immediately turning on my heels and using chakra strings, a trick I learned from some Suna puppeteer during the Third Shinobi World War, I was able to prevent the scrolls from clattering onto the floor. With my other hand, I caught him and leaned him against the wall where he was slowly sagging into a heap. I secured the scrolls, tagged him, and made him and the scrolls join the others. It was getting boring, tedious really, to take them out. I didn't remember any mission ever being this mind-numbingly easy and repetitive. The thrill of battle that got my heart pumping with glee on many occasions was surprisingly absent. The whole thing started to feel more like a chore than an actual battle. By now, I fully expected to have gotten at least one fight out of this. There had been a persistent itch for one since the moment I had seen how the village had treated my Naruto. So I dropped the henge and took a few steps into the break room. 5 of my clansmen were spread throughout. 2 of them were standing near a table with a tea set atop it. One of them poured himself a cup of tea that I had smelled all the way back in the corridor. 2 more were engaged in a soft conversation sitting on chairs in one corner of the room. Then there was the last person, who, after just closing a cabinet and fetching himself a box of baka, turned back to the room only to see me standing there. "Mikoto-sama, what are you doing here?" he asked when he finally overcame his surprise after a protracted few seconds in which I could have ended him and everyone in this room a dozen times over. His words alerted the others to my presence, and their eyes landed on me nearly simultaneously. Inclining my head sideways, with a smile, I answered truthfully, I am here to kill you. Please struggle to your heart's content. The one taking the first sip from his freshly poured tea nearly choked on it. As the one who had first addressed me said, surely, you are J-OK, that was as far as he got as the kunai I threw at him with a flick of my wrist was stopped just inches away from penetrating the skull of the sole girl in the room. Only the quick reflexes of her conversational partner, who caught the kunai midair, Sharingan ablaze, saved her from her brainstem being punctured. The shock of the rest was short-lived as they, too, flashed their Sharingan, and those already standing settled into a loose stance. Finally, I just hoped they wouldn't be too much of a disappointment. My kunai was returned to me in a vicious but well-aimed throw, which, to the chagrin of my adversaries, I had no trouble fishing out of the air, just in time to deflect the barrage of shuriken coming at me from the two at the tea counter. The girl tried to put me into a genjutsu as our eyes briefly met. It was a crude attempt that might have worked on Fugaku as untalented as he was at genjutsu. On me, the genjutsu didn't even take hold, washing over me without effect. Dropping the box, the last one in the room started a sequence of hand seals. It took him completing the first two to clue me in on what jutsu he was about to use. By then, the rest, sans the girl, were upon me, kunai in hand. Their initial attack wasn't half bad, perfectly timed, striking at different targets simultaneously. I met the attacks of two of them head-on, disrupting their timing. The kunai of the attacker to my right was blocked by my own, and I caught the kunai-wielding hand of the attacker to my left in an iron grip. This left only the one in the center, who, given the space constraints with the two allies beside him, had to rely on a thrust. Using the forward momentum of the attacker to my left, I slipped past his arm with a step to the side while simultaneously guiding him into the path of the thrust. It was only thanks to the Sharingan's insight that he could stop the thrust in time before the kunai was buried in his comrade's back. With that simple slip, I maneuvered them all into a line, right in front of me. It not only put a sudden stop to their plan of surrounding me should their first attack fail to bring me down but also put them into a position where they couldn't help each other for just a moment. This was an opportunity I took full advantage of by severing the tendons in his arms before I let go of his hand. A kick to the side of his knee, accompanied by the familiar crunch of it breaking, was my parting gift before I retreated back another step. A glance toward the back of the room confirmed that my last opponent was still attempting to use a jutsu. Him spewing a fireball when he ended the sequence of hand seals was something I couldn't allow him to do. Not because I had to fear the jutsu, blocking or evading it wouldn't be that difficult, even in this confined space. It was the fire it would undoubtedly result in with all the combustible items around which would be the problem. I was not referring to the reduced visibility it would create. I could deal with that, and was used to it, to be honest. There was hardly anyone out there worth their headband who hadn't tried to take away the advantage the Sharingan provided during a fight. Yet I doubted the same could be said about my adversaries. This didn't mean the smoke wouldn't be a problem. On the contrary, the smell would carry on the wind, and the smoke column, even at night with the scattered light coming from houses, might be visible and attract undue attention. I would be better off without it. Under normal circumstances, I would have used a genjutsu to take care of him. Subtly influencing someone into believing he had opened his mouth when he hadn't, thereby confining the molded fire chakra trying to escape his mouth to the inside of his body, would have been the most straightforward and efficient solution, using the inherent danger that molding chakra within your body carried against him by burning his inside to a crisp. Unfortunately, doing this would most certainly kill him. It would be a far cry from the usual injuries Uchiha clansmen suffered trying to learn this jutsu, since even when they failed, most of the harmful chakra got expelled out of their bodies, and the burns were limited to the mouth, making a burn to the throat or lungs exceedingly rare. Even those with a way for the chakra to escape were nothing life-threatening, unlike my genjutsu, which had been devised for one purpose only, to kill opponents using their own jutsu against themselves. Since I needed them alive, for now, I chose a different way to deal with him. Pulling at the chakra string extending from my finger to the shuriken sticking out of the walls behind me, they detached and were flung in wide arcs at the opponent in the back. Their numbers, despite their high speed, were nothing that anyone wielding a Sharingan should have a problem evading, which was precisely what I was counting on, for him to assume this to be a desperate attempt at stopping his jutsu from completion. He dodged the shuriken by the thinnest of margins. A small step to the side and inclining his head to the side was all it took to make them miss. In doing so, he positioned himself exactly where I wanted him to be. Thus, by the time he noticed the cage shuriken I had hidden in the shadow of the shuriken he had dodged, it was already too late to do anything about them. The widening of his eyes in surprise was immediately followed by a scream as his body was littered with metal stars. As a result, the control of his chakra wavered, and the jutsu was cancelled. The damage he suffered from my attack was concentrated on his arms stemming from his attempt to shield himself. His Konoha vest prevented the shuriken from inflicting more than superficial wounds on his torso, ensuring he would live while the ruined state of his arms would keep him out of the fight for good. All that was left was to make sure he wouldn't get any ideas like going looking for help. My other adversaries weren't idle while this happened and renewed their attack. Jumping over their comrade, who was cradling his knee on the floor, they fanned out, trying to flank me. I parried a kunai from the left and then ducked under a high kick from the right as I circled left. It moved me out of the reach of the adversary to the right, forcing him to follow along as I defended against the increasingly frantic attacks of my leftmost adversary. He must have realized that I was out of his league, and the only reason I hadn't skewered him yet was because of his friend. Every attack I would commit to would inevitably put me right back within his reach. Faced with non-Uchiha, I wouldn't hesitate a second to do exactly that, but against them, even if the short exchange allowed me to determine that my eye for insight was superior to theirs. It didn't make enough of a difference to allow me to escape unscathed, not within the limits of what I was willing to utilize against them. Additionally, I was convinced I hadn't seen the full extent of what he could do. His speed had increased compared to his first attack sandwiched between the others. The high kick I had previously evaded had been without flaw, fast, and powerful, an exact replica of what that guy kid showcased in his Jonin exam, and spoke volumes about his dedication, because without proper physical conditioning, not even copying from a master would replicate those attributes. If not for his partner, who was more a hindrance than a help, taking him down in taijutsu might actually be a decent workout. Still, before that could happen, I needed to get rid of any potential interlopers. While the sparks flew left and right from my kunai clashing against those of my attackers, I noticed from the corner of my eyes that the girl was readying another attack as she went through some familiar hand seals. Bringer of darkness. It was quite presumptuous to think Tobarama's anti-Uchiha genjutsu would work on the heiress of the clan. Still, it deserved credit for an Uchiha to make the effort in learning non-Sharingan-based genjutsu, and she'd had to learn it the hard way. Tobarama had gone to great lengths to guard his jutsus against being stolen with a glance from the Sharingan. It was exactly what I needed to create an opening for myself. Meeting the girl's eyes for an instant, I put a simple genjutsu on her a split second before she cast her own. I switched the position of me and her comrades in her perception, timed in such a way that even were she to notice the genjutsu and immediately flare her chakra to disperse it, it would inevitably disrupt her own. Doing both of those things simultaneously required a chakra control seen only in a select few each generation, a group she was not part of, given the minuscule amount of chakra I saw her waste in her first genjutsu. My opportunity to act arose the instant the eyes of the man in the back glazed over, informing me that the genjutsu had taken hold. I deflected the kunai aimed at my chest to the side and, for the first time in this exchange, went on the offensive myself. A step forward put me right past my adversary's guard with his arm flung to the side and out of position, leaving him vulnerable. A fast cut near the armpits severed the tendons in his arm as he tried to retract it to his body, only for him to lose any control of the limb, and the kunai it held clattered uselessly onto the floor. Instead of hurting him further to remove him from the fight for good, I punctured his neck with one of my senbon. Now that I was free to do so, I also threw a senbon at both of the other men lying on the floor in agony. It took mere seconds for their moans to subside. As a result, there were only 3 people left standing in the room. As I looked them over, it became clear that their ability to continue was questionable. The man was stumbling around, blinded by the genjutsu he was hit with. As always, I took the greatest pleasure in using my enemy's jutsu against them. The girl had managed to break my illusion just in time to witness her comrades being taken down. Condemned to facing me alone, she let her hands drop to her sides, finally coming to realize the futility of resisting, ready to accept her fate. It was not unheard of when people experienced an unsurmountable gap in ability that the will to fight left them, but I had expected better from an Uchiha. Obviously, I hadn't expected her to measure up to Kushina's lack of common sense, simply unable to comprehend the phrase, give up. Nobody would. Seeing an Uchiha doing it didn't feel right, though. I was about to act on my irritation when something unexpected happened, and the girl fell to her knees and prostrated on all fours in front of me, beseeching, Mikoto-sama, this unworthy one begs for your mercy. Please allow me to swear myself to you. Understandably, I was taken aback by this. Was this girl so pathetic as to resort to begging for her life? At first, I thought this might have been a ploy to divert my attention to her. A cursory glance around the room confirmed the status of her comrades. Still, I didn't drop my guard. Using the reflective surfaces of the metal dishes this bout spread across the floor allowed me a nearly unbroken view of my surroundings. Carefully moving in such a way that my body wouldn't obstruct the reflections of my blinded foe in the unlikely case he managed to break the genjutsu, I closed the distance to the girl, coming to a stop right in front of her. Shiger, right, look at me, I ordered to get a look at her eyes. When she complied, slowly lifting her head from the ground, the first thing that stood out was that she wasn't meeting my Sharingan with her own, and instead had chosen to deactivate them instead, adding to her vulnerability. I was searching her eyes for any hints of fear and deception and found none. She was genuine, which begged the question of why she had attacked me if she thought that way. She averted her eyes after a few moments in our staring contest with a faint blush on her cheeks and was staring at the ground as if it was the most interesting thing she had ever seen. My curiosity was piqued. I reached for the side of her head, placing my hand on her cheek, and gently forced her head to look at me again. As our eyes met once more, I advanced my eyes to the Mangekyou and took a look at her memories to confirm my suspicions. As it turned out, they were correct. From the moment I had made my intentions known, the girl had subtly tried to help me, painfully aware of taijutsu shortcomings that wouldn't allow her to do anything overt unless she wanted to risk being killed. She had known the first genjutsu she had used on me wouldn't even be enough to slow me down, and had used it, deliberately wasting chakra in the process, to invite my own genjutsu to stop her from using the second one. She had done all that to deceive her comrades into thinking she was fighting me with everything she had while, in truth, stacking the deck in my favor. She had the makings of a deep cover agent. It left a bad taste in my mouth that she could predict me this well, at least until I realized how she had done it. Not only had she consumed every single tidbit of information she could get her hands on about me, which had allowed her an understanding of me only a handful of people could match, and none of them still living. She also knew things about me no one should know, which was no surprise since she had cheated, quite hard at that. She had activated her Mangekyou Sharingan when she had witnessed the death of her mother, Seiko, my caretaker, who was only a few years my senior. She had been the only person within the clan I would have gone so far as to call a friend. She had been my sole link to the clan, a link that was severed when tragedy had struck and she died in childbirth of Shigeru's younger brother. I had showed her kindness as we both mourned the same person and tried to get her out of her toxic home life. I knew it would only become worse without Seiko there to shield her from her father's worst impulses. He had been maimed in the Third Shinobi World War, and, unable to cope with the end of his shinobi career, had sought refuge in sake bottles. It hadn't helped matters that, just like Kagami, he had wished for a son as an heir, and, unlike Shisui, Shigeru's brother hadn't turned out defective. Even though I had failed in getting Shigeru away from her father, I had Kagami to thank for that yet again. She had started idolizing me, her late mother's friend, who had cared for and fought for her. She had never blamed me for breaking off contact with her, because she had known the truth. One of her Mangekyou allowed her to witness the past, and the other let her see the future, something I had thought impossible. The ability, as she understood it, was limited, triggering on its own seemingly at random and showing her short visions of her future from her own eyes. Her other eye didn't seem to have the same restrictions, and allowed her to view past events that took place at the location she used it. It explained why she was nearly blind in her right eye. Both abilities took a heavy toll on her eyes, and without being able to control her glimpses of the future, not daring to experiment with it, fearing she could accelerate her descent into darkness, blindness was inevitable. This was in contrast to the damage to her left eye, which was completely self-inflicted on her quest to learn more about me. It had been the only way she had thought she could give herself the illusion of being close to me after she had learned what Kagami had done to me. It had been heartwarming to see the despair she had felt for my sake, while at the same time, I should have felt resentment for her inaction, even though seeking me out would have changed nothing. The opposite was true. It could easily have made things worse for both of us. She also had a very convincing excuse. Having seen a glimpse of this exact moment, she had known I would eventually rid myself of the chains cast upon me. It was a curiosity that she had seen the vision of this moment years ago. It was an outlier that allowed her a look far further into the future than the mere days of any other vision she had ever, the common factor that every time it had happened, she had been forewarned about a situation in which her life was arguably in danger. This one didn't fit alongside the other premonitions. Not only did she remember her eye bleeding uncontrollably after receiving the vision, but she shortly thereafter indicated a far greater strain than all her previous and later visions, and strongly hinted at a correlation between the burden and how far into the future the event shown to her was located. Yet it also hadn't saved her life, at least not from me. Since she fulfilled all the requirements I was looking for in members to rebuild the clan with, I had no intention of killing or inflict lasting harm on her. The same couldn't be said about the rest of my clan. On second thought, taking into account her emotional state when she had received that vision and what she was about to do, it became clear that it had saved her life, even though it didn't look like it at first glance. She had been given exactly the information needed to stay her hand from doing something desperate in trying to save me, and knowing I would free myself would do the trick. I could only assume the deck was stacked against her and that she would have inevitably failed. This obviously meant that those random snippets she was shown weren't truly that random, and her ability was more than just showing her the moments before death's cold embrace. It was influencing her decisions to get her to walk down a path that wouldn't kill, was as if her visions had a mind of their own. Since the girl was still staring up at me, awaiting my decision, I finally said, "Do you even have to ask? As Seiko's daughter, there will always be a place at my side for you." A shy smile was the response I received. "Sleep," I said as I jabbed her with a senbon hidden in my hand, cupping her face. "We will talk once you awaken." Before she could form a reply, she lost consciousness and slumped against my hand. I gently lowered her to the floor and proceeded with her as I had with the others, putting a paralyzing seal on her and then storing her in my Kamui dimension. By the time I stood up from my crouched position on the floor, my last remaining adversary had stopped his stumbling around. He had his guard up, his head turned sideways, and was attentively listening to any sound in the room. I couldn't help but sigh at this pathetic display. Here I had held at least some hope regarding the skill of this one, only for him to also fall short of my expectations. While not immediately breaking out of the illusion he was caught in was forgivable, still being trapped in it after all this time was not. I granted him that Bringer of Darkness was undoubtedly a nasty piece of genjutsu designed to stop the brain from receiving signals from the optic nerve, thereby rendering the Sharingan useless. It also, unlike most other genjutsu, didn't just loosely attach itself to one's chakra network like a wet leaf to one's skin, so it couldn't be easily dislodged by simply stilling and flaring one's chakra. It instead encircled your chakra, functioning more like a bracelet. As a result, a chakra burst originating inside the body, extending outwards instead of blowing it away, would just put a strain on it and stretch it outwards, because the bracelet would experience an equal force in every direction, ultimately keeping it in place. In theory, it could be ripped apart by a single sufficiently sharp and powerful burst of chakra, but not many possess the power or chakra control required for that, and even fewer possessed both. The more elegant method involved grabbing the bracelet with your chakra and essentially slipping out of it, or first cutting it off and then blasting it away. As a last resort, one could use a rhythmic burst to strain the bracelet until it eventually dissolved, which was impractical and, worse, time-intensive. Nonetheless, it was a method that any Chunin and above should at least be familiar with. An Uchiha with our clan leanings towards genjutsu and clear advantages in that regard had even less of an excuse. He was just another failure, and since in this day and age there was no Tobirama to expunge him from our bloodline, the duty fell to me. Yet first, I wanted to see how far he could go in his chosen specialty. Bringing my left hand up in a tiger seal, I cancelled the genjutsu. It was no easy feat to cancel someone else's genjutsu from a distance, doing it to a high-level illusion even less so, so I had to resort to using a hand seal to succeed on my first try. This was a clear indication that my chakra control was slipping because of the eyes I had recently acquired. It was a problem to be solved at a later time. Readying myself to the extent my dress allowed me, I waited for my opponent to come out of his stupor so we could continue where we had left off. My adversary's face was displaying more than one question that my kunai aimed at his throat prevented from ever being voiced. He swatted it out of the air with his palm, and then he was upon me. I deflected his right fist while he was pivoting on his right foot. I slipped closer to him, and his left leg met my right leg, canceling each other out before it could gain any noteworthy momentum. Immediately upon his leg touching the ground, he tried to gain some distance to make room for another kick. Aware that this particular form of taijutsu was the most devastating when able to use its powerful spinning and flying kicks, I didn't let him get away. We ended up moving in unison. Every time he took a step back, I took a step forward, while our limbs were engaged in a violent exchange of blows. Every attack was stopped by a block and followed up by another attack and another block. It went on that way for a few seconds with dozens and hundreds of attacks blocked, dodged, or deflected, fizzling uselessly. Neither of us was able to penetrate the other's defenses and land more than a glancing blow. Caught in a stalemate, I was considering rending my dress. The additional freedom of movement my legs would gain should give me the advantage. I was about to do just that when I noticed a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead, and his breathing grew more labored with every exchange. He was clearly having problems keeping up with our high-speed exchange. This was something he was acutely aware of if his increasingly more desperate attacks were any indicator. As I slipped beneath another of his punches and my blow aimed at his ribs was stopped by his elbow, I wondered how it could be that a clearly taijutsu favoring member of my clan was flagging after a short bout. It didn't make any sense unless he was another fraud who had only invested the time needed for his muscles to make use of the full range of Gai's taijutsu for a short duration at the expense of burning through his stamina. Combined with his Sharingan, it would easily carry him through every fight. Using them, I was sure, he consistently managed to win spars against Guy, thinking himself to be his superior. Yet that ignored the fact that a spar followed its own set of rules, rules that in many cases disadvantaged certain characteristics like the ability to take blows while emphasizing technique and landing clean blows, which in a spar would never be executed at full power. Besides, if my impression of Guy's personality was accurate, I doubted he could even be convinced to take off those weights he hid in his leg warmers. It was people like him who gave our clan a bad name. In the past, we belittled members who merely copied the skills of others while resting on their laurels, but he was so inept that he couldn't even get that right. He had been unwilling or incapable of investing the work needed to make his copy equivalent to the original skill set he had observed, and was instead content with using an inferior one. Witnessing what I had over the years, a prisoner within my own home, I had resigned myself to the members of my clan wasting our gifts, and I no longer harbored any hope that members of our clan would improve upon something they picked up. Gone were the times when our clan strived for perfection, but this was just disgraceful. It wouldn't be long now, and there would be a noticeable drop in his speed. From there, winning the fight decisively could be done with relative ease, not that I intended to give him the satisfaction of losing to me by being outlasted. No, for that display, for squandering our name, for not putting in the work to make that style truly his, he deserved to witness it being dismantled firsthand. He needed to fully experience the folly of his ways as he was crushed under my heel. In order to do that, I adjusted my strategy. Instead of continuing to deflect his attacks, I purposely blocked a blow. The force behind it was enough to momentarily halt my movement, an opportunity my adversary had desperately waited for. He didn't hesitate and created the desperately sought distance between us, taking the bait. Just as anticipated, he used the space he was presented with to launch a spinning kick aimed at my head. It, at first glance, was a perfectly executed attack, utilizing the full scope of his body's strength in addition to the centrifugal force of his half-spin. It was a kick, sharp, fast, and more importantly powerful enough to break through a block with my hands, possibly capable of breaking them, but definitely able to stagger me if it were to hit. It would keep me at bay, and would also enable follow-up attacks, which were why I didn't allow it to connect. I timed it in such a way that when his Sharingan would show him what I was about to do, he was already fully committed to his attack and unable to change its trajectory. Raising my elbows over my head, I slipped beneath his kick while redirecting his leg ever so slightly upwards. It was a minor deviation from its course that should not have affected a martial artist who had performed any move in his repertoire 1,000, 10,000, or 100,000 times against various dummies in the slightest. Their bodies were acutely aware of exactly how they had to react to a kick being slightly off target, what muscles they had to use to compensate when a kick just grazed an opponent. His body had never learned those lessons. It also didn't help matters that he wasn't wearing any weights on his legs, tainting the imitation of what he had witnessed by him trying to adapt it to his body, which had a vastly different distribution of mass compared to Guy's. So, it came as no surprise to me when his balance faltered before he had finished a half-turn around his axis, being forced to consciously shift his balance, which only just barely allowed him to avoid crumbling into a heap. Readjusting his balance mid-spin came at a considerable cost, resulting in the loss of a great amount of momentum and speed. This turned an attack that was supposed to make it nearly impossible for anyone to close the distance between his kicks into a joke. Additionally, his near stumble also prevented him from building up more speed and momentum on its second round. It was a cakewalk to slip through the gap this created in his defense between his two attacks. It was unfathomable to me how someone could overlook such a fatal flaw that should have become obvious within the span of a few dozen serious spars. When I got within arm's reach of him, he had his back turned to me with one leg in the air. That allowed me the use my legs even within the constraints of my dress. With his whole weight situated on one leg, I swept his leg from under him with a kick against his ankle. The specific sound of a breaking bone was absent. my tightly fitting dress preventing me from putting the full power of my hips into the kick, but it was still more than enough to uproot him. His leg uncontrollably flew past his hip height, the effects of my kick and the remaining momentum of his attempted second kick twisting his body into something resembling an ugly art piece as he shifted in midair, trying to brace himself for his landing. My attack would have stopped here if I had managed to break his leg and thereby succeeded in removing his ability to use his kicks. Unfortunately, I couldn't rely on my little trick working again. I extended the knuckle of my right hand middle finger and struck his spine. A moment later, he hit the ground with a groan. He immediately used his arms to push himself up into the air, intending to flip himself upright before I could push my attack. It failed spectacularly. Instead of getting his legs under his torso, they just flailed uselessly through the air. Without any tension in his lower appendages, let alone directed movement, they gave out the instant they touched the ground, and he collapsed into a mess of tangled limbs. With glee, I watched my perturbed adversary as he attempted to get his legs working again. It took him far longer than I would have thought possible to realize what I had done, and I could easily determine the exact instant he did, because the sweet fear he emanated throughout our encounter accompanying his life and death struggle turned into outright panic from one moment to the next. When his eye landed on me again, there was an unvoiced plea in his eye that sent a pleasant shiver down my spine. It was not what I had wanted to get out of this at all. I wanted a fight, an opportunity to ease myself back into things. Having lived the dull life of a trophy wife for the last few years, I had thought I could use this to get back my edge, something I knew would inevitably be lost without true challenges, and training by oneself can only do so much to retain it over such a long time. Admittedly, I hadn't expected much from them going into this, but for the whole group of them to prove unable to land a single clean hit on me while I was holding back fell short of even those expectations. As a result, I had to settle for reveling in the fear I could instill in my opponents. It was a bad habit to play with one's food, one I had picked up from my sensei, so just this once, I decided to indulge in it. It had been some time since the last person had looked at me like that. With measured steps, I followed my wounded prey, carefully keeping the distance between us the same. His short frantic escape came to a sudden end when his back hit the wall. His eyes widened, and when he looked away to see what was behind him, I moved. I had him pinned against the wall before he could turn his head back. "You have been found wanting," I whispered into his ear as I pricked his neck with one of my senbon. His body fell unconscious a few heartbeats later. Placing a seal on his forehead, I proceeded to store him with the others in my Kamui dimension. I took one last look around before I disappeared, too. My cage Bunshin would take care of the patrolling Uchiha upon their return. Knowing myself, one would sit under a hinge at the front desk while the other would hang from the ceiling, right above the door, just waiting to fall on top of them. All that was left was Naruto. Despite my dislike for Naruto's living situation, with him having to live in a two-room apartment on the eastern edge of the civilian district, I had to admit it made finding him that much easier for me. All I had to do was look for a lone Anbu member perched atop one of the abandoned warehouses, and by extension, I would find him. Using Kamui to peek through the metaphoric keyhole of its dimension, it took me less than a minute to succeed. The Anbu operative didn't even bother hiding, solely relying on a simple genjutsu altering the slope of the roof he was on so that his crouched self comfortably fit under the fake roof. Even were I inclined to forgive him for the use of a genjutsu that any academy student in their third year should be able to notice, I couldn't ignore the sheer hubris necessary to change the immediate vicinity of his charge's home, one that Naruto should know like the back of his hand, and think he would go unnoticed. This level of complacency should get him kicked out of Anbu immediately. On second thought, getting your charge abducted right under your nose might make that happen regardless. The next few days certainly wouldn't be enjoyable for him, and if I were a more agreeable person, I might have cared. As things stood, he should call himself lucky that he was wearing a Konoha headband, and I couldn't afford to alienate the village, for now. I materialized behind the rain barrel on Naruto's apartment roof, out of sight from the vantage point of the Anbu operative. Lifting one of my Zori while bending my knee, I reached for a small pebble embedded in the sole and removed it. It took me merely an instant to weave a complex sound-triggered genjutsu on the pebble, before I tossed it in a wide arc over the rain barrel at the place where the Anbu was hiding. Straining my ears, I could hear the pebble land and then skitter to a halt. Only then I stepped out from behind my cover and briefly peeked in his direction to ensure that my genjutsu had taken hold. For the next few minutes, the genjutsu would block anything out of the ordinary from his perception. The best part of the jutsu was that instead of just making him ignore something as much less complex genjutsu were capable of doing by altering the target's behavior, this one actually forced the target's mind to overwrite the reality of what he perceived. As a result, his memories of that event were consistent with how he experienced it, preventing mind readers and the affected from recalling what actually occurred at a later time. If there was one thing I was certain of, it was that the moment Naruto's absence would be discovered, this Anbu member would end up strapped to a table in T&I with half a dozen Yamanaka trawling through his memories, trying to find the one responsible. Naturally, the objective was not to obfuscate who was responsible for his abduction. On the contrary, my plans required me to own up to the fact eventually. However, I needed to buy some time and direct the focus of attention onto Naruto's retrieval rather than the sudden disappearance of the Uchiha clan, even though they would be hard-pressed to dismiss a connection between those two events out of hand. Nonetheless, my plan rested on the assumption that this would be enough to forestall the Uchiha clan being declared traitors to the village with kill-on-sight orders issued for all of us until I was finished and could present the village with a fait accompli. With a one-handed cartwheel on the ledge of Naruto's roof, I softly landed on his terrace beneath, directly in front of his glass door. It took a moment to straighten out my kimono and cheeking for any tears the fabric might have suffered despite my best efforts to prevent it from being stained by keeping my legs together for most of the cartwheel. I was about to reach for the door handle when I caught a whiff of pepper. It immediately prompted me to freeze, and my mind went back to the conversation with my brother just a few hours ago in which he had described my Naruto as a trap genius. It was hard to deny that he had made a good point when I nearly ran into one of them just now. Although, I had to admit I might be a bit rusty and hadn't been expecting any trouble at this stage of the mission. Even so, crafting a trap that nearly escaped my notice until it was too late was no easy feat, far from it, in fact. Considering that I only noticed it because he had used a component with a strong smell within a faulty packaging spoke volumes in itself. For a moment, I pondered just using Kamui, making myself intangible, and stepping through the glass door, circumventing his traps, but where would be the fun in that? So, I took my time and inspected the door thoroughly. Two things stood out: a barely visible trail of a powdery substance on the upper doorframe, and two small bulges close to each other, one above the door handle and the other at the same height on the frame of the inwards opening door. My initial assumption placed what I assumed to be a pepper powder concoction on top of the doorframe. It was supposed to rain down on anyone crossing the threshold. I also suspected the bulge on the door was the result of something like an anchor to tie a rope around, whereas the bulge in the frame had to be a hook to guide the same rope through. In most cases, this meant the rope would be wound around the trigger of a cocked crossbow or something similar, just waiting for the moment the rope was pulled taut. It wasn't a bad trap. Simple, while still effective. Not in regards to killing an intruder, the pepper powder was an irritant at best if you allowed yourself to get covered in it. Some watery eyes and a runny nose were not suited to stop someone for good. Besides, the conveyor bolt released from a contraption was hardly anything a run-of-the-mill chunin shouldn't have any problems evading. Still, I doubted that was even the intended goal. I found it far more likely it had been designed as an alarm system. A bolt or kunai being blocked, or hitting glass or wood, was hardly a silent affair, and pepper powder had the nasty habit of making people sneeze. The apparent way to avoid those traps by simply breaking the glass door would still end up serving the purpose of the trap by waking a sleeping Naruto, despite leaving the door untouched with neither the rope being pulled nor the pepper powder falling on the intruder. The dispersal pattern from the thin trail of pepper powder I could make out on the door frame suggested that he had placed some kind of container on the door, which was most likely leaning against the frame. I was confident that if I opened the door slowly that I would be able to locate the exact position of the container and attach a chakra string to it to keep it and its contents in place. That left only the rope, and what was attached to it, to disable. I figured that by opening the door a tiny crack, I should be able to squeeze a kunai in between and cut the rope before it went taut and could trigger the mechanism. Traps like this required a small margin of error so that they wouldn't be tripped accidentally via thermal expansion or the occasional vibration. Picking the lock with a senbon barely took a second. I then slowly opened the door, just far enough that I could identify exactly where the pepper powder was located. Just as predicted, there was a cylindrical container leaning against the doorframe. Mentally, I congratulated my Naruto for his choice of the container, because the round surface area would make any attempt to keep it in place with mundane means more difficult. Not so with a chakra string. Considering the fact that outside of Suna it was considered an obscure, and mostly useless, art, I could excuse this oversight. With the threat of the container spilling its contents over me contained, I redirected my attention to the door handle and the cord I found there, just as I had expected. Lacking a kunai, I formed a short chakra scalpel at the end of my finger and was about to cut when I noticed a nearly transparent ninja wire running alongside the cord. I might have missed it without possessing a Sharingan and the superior eyesight that came with it, even when not active. Curious, I closed the door a bit more as I watched the cord and wire intently. In response, the cord slackened, however, the wire stayed taut. Ingenious. There was something hanging off the wire. This meant that were I to cut it together with the cord, thereby disarming the mechanism attached to the cord, it would spring the wire mechanism. If I had to guess from what I had seen so far, it might be something as simple as a bell suspended in the air from which, if the wire were to be cut, whatever hung would fall to the floor, most likely in a noisy fashion. With a comprehensive understanding of what I was facing, I cut the cord and then proceeded, slowly opening the door until the pepper powder container above fit through the crack and could be guided safely into my right hand. By now, the door was far enough ajar that I could comfortably stick my left hand inside and close it around the wire. I cut it, too. Holding the wire in place, I was finally able to open the door, and I slipped inside. As it turned out, my assumptions about Naruto's traps were relatively spot on, with some minor deviations. Instead of a crossbow, the cord led to a taut slingshot attached to a trigger mechanism, and the wire to a baby rattle. With narrowed eyes, I lowered the baby rattle, painted with toad motifs, to the floor. If that was all Jiraiya could bring himself to do for his godson, he had utterly failed my already low expectations of him, and had just confirmed that it had been the right decision to lock him out of the Uzumaki compound. I allowed my gaze to wander, in part wary of an additional layer of traps, and in part to get a comprehensive impression of his living conditions. To say I didn't like what I saw was an understatement, if there ever was one. I was downright furious that anyone would allow any child to live like that, and the fact that it was Naruto only made it worse. The supposed living room was nothing more than a garbage dump. There was no way to sugarcoat it, because that is what it was. Dirty laundry carelessly discarded was strewn about the entire floor. The small table in the middle of the room was stacked with dirty dishes with food remnants still clinging to them in various stages of going stale. With the spread of spoiled food not limited to just the table, all manner of bugs were skittering around. It was a result of Kushina's sense of chaos turned up to 11 combined with the distinct lack of common sense only a child could have. Someone had obviously failed to teach him that leaving perishable goods lying around wasn't exactly conducive to his health. It took taking a tentative step into that mess for my nose to be assaulted by the abominable stink of all of this, which was magnitudes worse than any battlefield stained by blood and human excrement could ever hope to be. Crushing a cockroach beneath my torii, it became balefully obvious that everything my brother said, explicitly or merely implied, turned out to be true. I knew that things had been bad for him, but I had never imagined he would have been left to his own devices to such a degree. This went far beyond the attempted conditioning he mentioned. What had the Hokage been thinking? I cut off my train of thought. There was no point in pondering that question, because it wouldn't matter after today, I wouldn't allow it to. Entering the bedroom, the situation didn't noticeably improve. The only difference was that the floor was mostly littered with clothes piled up in 3 large mounds, one in each corner of the room not occupied by a bed, instead of old food. Sprawled on it, with his blanket only covering one of his legs, was my Naruto. His left hand was laying on his stomach within his partly undone kimono. Seeing him like this, soundly asleep, his frizzly hair buried in his pillow, and a thin trail of saliva running down the corner of his mouth, the resemblance, short of the color of his hair, to Kushina was undeniable. I would have liked nothing better than to watch him sleep like this for hours, but I regrettably didn't have the time. I was just about to cross the small distance separating me from Naruto when my instincts were suddenly screaming at me. Having escaped the clutches of death more than once by listening to them, I didn't hesitate for an instant and immediately became intangible using Kamui. I had acted not a moment too late, because a lightning-clad hand emerged from between the valleys of Mai, followed by the rest of a body. The uninterrupted momentum carried my attacker straight toward the wall next to Naruto's sleeping form, not offering any meaningful resistance. It simply shattered on contact with the jutsu held in my attacker's hand, leaving a huge hole in his wake. A heartbeat later, the sound of the impact, mixed with what sounded like hundreds of chirping birds, coming from behind reached me. Midair, surrounded by dust and debris, my attacker twisted his body around so that his head, hidden behind an animal mask, ended up facing my way. He hit the ground on all fours, digging small trenches with his limbs into it as he skidded to a halt. By the time he looked back up from the glance he spared to make sure he hadn't screwed up his landing, he found Naruto's room empty of my presence, as I had reappeared right behind him. This granted him barely enough time for the muscles in his neck to stiffen in alarm before the senbon between my fingers were plunged into them. To my astonishment, he somehow managed to start pushing his body off the ground and away from me, before the poison took effect mid-motion and his legs gave out under him. He collapsed immediately thereafter with his face hitting the dirt, dislodging his mask in the process. Lying unmoving and staring up at me with a Sharingan in his left eye was none other than Hatake Kakashi. It was such a fortuitous encounter running into him here, saving me the trouble of having to hunt him down later on. Tilting my head, I kneeled next to him. I am glad you decided to return my clan's property of your own volition. His eyes widened in response to my words, but there was nothing he could do as my hand descended on his left eye and plucked it right out of its socket. I took a moment to carefully examine the eye for any damage its prolonged stay in a non-Uchiha body might have caused. It was only when I was satisfied with its pristine condition that I called forth my Susanoo and added it to my collection. Although I had expected Obito's left eye to be connected to his right eye's Kamui dimension in some fashion, the ability to open up a portal of varying size at range still came as a surprise. However, it by no means redeems your action concerning your treatment of Naruto, and there will be a price to pay for your neglect, I informed him while tagging him with a paralyzing seal. With Kakashi taken care of, I surveyed the damage he had just done. With just a cursory glance, I realized that my plan to abscond with Naruto without anyone noticing his absence for some time had just gone up in smoke. What's more, I had my suspicion that the use of that signature jutsu of his might have left some characteristic traces. Since I would ultimately have to own up to Naruto's abduction, I absolutely couldn't afford being suspected of any involvement in Kakashi's sudden disappearance. There was a marked difference between attacking your kin compared to attacking someone outside your clan donning a Konoha headband. As a result, I was confronted with the question of what to do with him. I couldn't default to my first instinct to simply kill him and leave his body here to rot. Altering his memories was also not an option, considering I had no intention whatsoever of returning Obito's eye to him. So, regardless of what memory I decided to implant in his mind to explain the loss of his eye, suspicion would still fall upon me, not to mention that it might tip people of that someone was capable of altering memories. There was also a nagging question I desperately wanted an answer to: why didn't he take care of Naruto? To obtain an answer, I would prefer being able to take my sweet time to find it, by sifting through all of his memories, something that was best done in the relative peace of the Uzumaki compound, away from prying eyes. Moreover, chances were I wouldn't like what I would find in his memories and, as a result, would have to dispose of Kakashi. The particulars only mattered insofar as to determine how much pain I would inflict upon him before granting him the mercy of death. Then there was Naruto to consider. I would rather not have to alter his memories, and since Naruto had been watching the proceedings through the hole in the wall ever since my Susanoo disappeared, it was a warranted precaution. He shouldn't be confronted with death and the realities of life as shinobi for a few years yet. The less he knew, the better, especially if he shared Kushina's tendency to blab out secrets. Looking back, it had been a wonder her status as a Jinchuriki had never leaked out. Reaching into Kakashi's tool pouch, I retrieved an explosive note before I activated Kamui to make him disappear. It seemed my introduction would have to wait. I then stood up and looked right into Naruto's eyes. Casting a simple genjutsu was all it took to put him to sleep. A moment later, I appeared next to him and caught his body as it was sliding to the floor. I carefully lifted Naruto up into my arms. I created another cage bunshin and handed over the explosive note to her. She would wait here until my other clones succeeded in bringing in the stragglers of the Uchiha police force, and would then make sure to erase all traces of us ever being here. Given Kakashi's actions, nothing short of blowing up the hovel they had made Naruto live in would suffice. That would alert the village higher-ups to the disappearance of the Uchiha police force when not one of them showed up to investigate despite the destruction of civilian property falling within their jurisdiction. It would definitely shorten the time I had at my disposal, which was why I didn't linger. With one last nod to my clone, Naruto and I were swallowed up by Kamui. We reappeared in the ritual room deep in the belly of the Uzumaki compound. I softly laid Naruto down near the first patch of the Uchiha prisoners littering the floor. To my delight, two of my clones were already present and had begun with the preparations of the room and the prisoners. The small children and the few elderly at their feet alluded to which of my clones they were. With one of my clones still in the process of drawing the life transfer seal in the center of the room, I decided to take advantage of the waiting time. First, I popped a soldier pill, undoubtedly not the last I would need to get through this night. The chakra expenditure of half a dozen cage bunshin for an extended period of time and the few small jutsu I had used up to this point were already taking their toll on my body. Age and relative inaction over the last few years were not doing me any favors either. Although, if those seals I took from Kushina's room worked as advertised, I just might be able to reach new, previously thought impossible, heights. While a warm sensation was spreading throughout my body as the soldier pill did its job, I went ahead and began securing Kakashi's limbs. Unlike my kinsman, I couldn't kill him just yet, regardless of the outcome of probing his mind. For one, I had to give his body the time to flush the poison out of his system. It was more than unlikely that anyone could tie the concoction back to me, but as one of the foremost poison experts in the village, I would end up a suspect regardless. This was especially true since my actions today would remind the village that I was still very much alive and more than a forgotten footnote in the annals of history. Kakashi, despite all his faults, was a resourceful shinobi, and it would be foolish to trust a paralyzing seal to keep a student of Minato Namikaze immobilized. There was also the problem of the decomposition of his body to consider. It would allow drawing an accurate conclusion of his time of death, and unfortunately, there were means to determine if a body had been put into stasis. For this very reason, I couldn't rely on sealing his body to obfuscate the time of his demise. Still, I was getting ahead of myself. First, I needed to see Kakashi's memories in order to determine the extent of his guilt. With Kakashi's hands and feet bound, I turned him onto his back and forced his remaining eye open. Kakashi's memories provided me with some very interesting events. From everything I learned, two things stood out to me. Kakashi joining Root in the subsequent assassination attempt on the third Hokage at Danzo's behest. In that instance, it wasn't the attempt that was unexpected, but that he had gotten away with it, as did the one who had given the order when both should have been executed. They weren't because Kakashi had changed his mind at the last minute and showed some remorse. This was a clear indication, if there ever was one, that the third sentimental side was a weakness, and this was only the most recent instance in which enemies had managed to exploit it. Still, what had my blood boiling was learning that Danzo had held a Mokuden user within his ranks during the Kyuubi attack. He had held the means to protect the village, to protect Kushina and Minato, and chose not to utilize them. It was because of him that Naruto had grown up an orphan. It was an unforgivable sin, one I would make sure he paid for in full. Yet as much as I would like nothing more than to march right into his lair and find ways to redefine the phrase, torture to death, with him as the guinea pig, a role he had more than just volunteered for with his actions, I couldn't. It was not right moment to do so, nor would it be for some time. It all came back to us needing to rely on Konoha for protection. I couldn't afford to weaken Konoha any further than I already had. Otherwise, it might invite attacks from the other major villages and put Naruto at risk. No, I had to bide my time and gather more strength for Naruto's sake. The first step towards that goal was to increase the quality of the members I had deemed had some future use for Naruto by promoting their eyes to the next level. I had wondered for years about the particulars of the Mangekyou Sharingan. Not much was known about the requirements for gaining a specific ability. Even reading the stone slab after gaining an eternal Mangekyou Sharingan hadn't provided me with a satisfying answer to the question. The absence of detailed records, most likely out of fear that they could be stolen and end up in the hands of our enemies, didn't help matters. My forefathers, if they had bothered at all, had been content with writing down the names of those who had managed to unlock their eyes. Over the years, a small number of people had achieved it. Contrary to popular belief, Madara had not been the first to do so, far from it, in fact. It really should not have come as a surprise, as it was impossible to constantly wage wars against other clans without someone here and there going through the preconditions of witnessing despair to awaken them, which I now knew to be an inaccurate transcription. Yet those who had, just like Madara, were infamous, reviled even by the Uchiha clan, and many had died at the hands of their kin, either slain for their crimes or their lost sanity, which had faded along with the light of their eyes, or both. The difference between them and Madara, who had irrefutably carved himself a place in history by founding Konoha together with Hashirama and Mito, was they could easily be extinguished from recorded memory and subsequently forgotten. Unless, of course, you knew where to look, and happened to be the clan head's daughter. What I intended to find out was if there was some kind of underlying rule set, such that it would allow me to influence or outright affect which ability one would gain when their eyes awoke. What was it that determined it? Personality, blood, or something else entirely? Kakashi's memories provided me with the last piece of the puzzle to form a coherent theory. It was based upon two events, to be exact. Obito's presumed death, witnessed by Kakashi, made it clear that at the time his body had been crushed, my cousin hadn't had access to Kamui yet. It was absolutely inconceivable for any shinobi to hazard taking that kind of damage to their bodies if it could be avoided, and there was no doubt about it. His body was a mangled mess. Kakashi saw enough for me to be sure of it. The second event was the death of Rin. With the sole exception of what happened to Obito, it was the only other event providing the required level of despair to advance a Sharingan to its next stage. It was only a guess, but, given the situation they found themselves in when Rin threw herself in the path of Kakashi's jutsu, Obito also might have been present, because I really had a hard time coming up with an explanation as to how Kakashi, after he had plunged his hand through her heart, could survive that encounter surrounded by enemies as he had been. Someone must have taken care of them mere moments after he had fainted from the shock of his actions. Disregarding teleportation, this meant that someone had to have been close by, within sight of Kakashi and Rin, in order to be able to interfere in time. If I factored in the state of the battlefield after he woke up, with the whole Kiri platoon butchered to the last shinobi, their blood and intestines littering the area, it all looked more like the work of a savage beast than that of a skilled shinobi. The restraint and precision that came with proficiency at killing were conspicuously absent. Instead, I noted an undercurrent of unrestrained rage. The lack of variation or distinguishable patterns suggested a single perpetrator drunk on power great enough to casually overwhelm his opposition. It was exactly what I would expect the aftermath of Cousin Obito enacting bloody vengeance on those responsible for the death of his beloved Rin to look like. The conclusion I drew from this was that the requirements for achieving a Mangekyou Sharingan with the ability of Kamui boiled down to the following. One set of Sharingan eyes had to be spatially separated, and both wearers needed to witness the death of a person they both cared about, at the same time. It was possible the person had to die at the hand of one of them. This, in turn, meant that my running theory boiled down to the idea that the abilities granted by achieving a Mangekyou Sharingan were solely dependent on the specific triggering conditions. The small sample size wasn't conclusive, and as much as I would have liked to view the memories of both my father and my brother, the risk of falling under their sway wasn't worth it. This left putting that theory to practice, and as it happened, I had a whole clan of Sharingan-bearing shinobi lying at my feet. There was only one thing left to do before I could begin in earnest. I needed one last tool. Luckily I knew exactly where to get it. A short walk over the paralyzed bodies brought me to my destination, where Fugaku's bound body was lying on the ground. I momentarily paused, savoring the knowledge that the last thing he would ever see was me looking down on him. Bending down next to him, I plucked his eyes right out of his fear-stricken skull, thus sentencing him to spend his last moments in absolute darkness. I couldn't think of a more fitting punishment for someone who worshipped our eyes. Calling forth my Susanoo, one of its many limbs reached for Fugaku's eyes resting in the palm of my hand and inserted them into one of the countless empty eye slots it possessed across its body. The effects, just as they had been in the previous instances, were immediate, and I instinctively learned the basics of his Mangekyou Sharingan abilities Tsukuyomi and Amenami Nakanushi. At the moment, I didn't care much for the latter, and just acknowledged it being added to my repertoire. Tsukuyomi, on the other hand, was exactly the tool I needed. A jutsu able to trap the target after eye contact into an illusion of the user's design, powerful enough to make them experience days' worth of torture within a single moment, and able to inflict a tremendous amount of psychological damage to the recipient, putting them into a comatose state. It was next to impossible to escape the effects of Tsukuyomi because of the nearly instantaneous speed it worked at, rendering the usual methods to combat genjutsu useless. All these qualities made it one of the most powerful genjutsu in existence. However, I wasn't interested in the damage the jutsu could cause in a fight. I was far more interested in the limits of the illusions themselves, especially in regards to how convincing they could be made, because if I could manage to make them indistinguishable from reality, they then could be used to make the chosen ones of my kin go through their customized experiences of despair. Hopefully, this would allow me to trigger their Mangekyou Sharingan. This would also allow me to test my theory about the same trigger conditions being responsible for the same powers. Conditions that, in the case of recreating Kamui, weren't easily met. There was no shortage of Sharingan, allowing for plenty of transplants, but I only had one pair of people I could be reasonably sure had the same deep-rooted feelings for the same person. Unfortunately, those feelings were not of the romantic nature as I suspected was the case when it came to Obito and Kakashi's feelings for Rin, even though the latter was in denial about them. Akane and Aoi were identical twins. Their father had gotten himself killed a few years back shortly after the twins' birth, leaving their mother with the responsibility of raising them both on her own. He was one of the few fatalities we suffered outside war, which took a special kind of incompetence. Luckily, the children showed no signs of inheriting any of their father's less desirable traits. Their mother had been a relatively competent Tokubetsu Jonin until her retirement following her husband's death. She was the only person the 4-year-old girls had any sort of close relationship with, so by creating an illusionary repeat of the event that led to Obito and Kakashi obtaining Kamui, they just might end up with the same eyes. Should the illusion fail to be convincing, in the worst case, I would have to make them reenact it in reality. It would be a waste of a perfectly healthy body, but at the end of the day, it would be worth it. I found the two girls one of my clones had stolen from their beds and deposited on the ground. Akane, in her genjutsu-induced sleep, was still clutching her stuffed cat to her chest. They both looked the same since I last saw them, wearing their Uchiha black hair in mirrored asymmetrical lobes, with a bang running alongside their cheeks to help anyone who wasn't their mother tell them apart. I went down onto my knees and moved Akane's bang out of the way to allow me better, unimpeded access to her right eye. Using my left hand, I parted her eyelids, severed the optic nerve, and removed her eye. I then proceeded to Aoi and repeated the process of removing her right eye and began the arduous and time-consuming process of implanting the eye in my hand. It required the careful reconnection of every single strand of the eye's optic nerves to their corresponding counterparts. This was no easy task, because a single mistake could have devastating effects on the eye's abilities. It was the first time my self-taught medical knowledge was actually put to use. I had originally started to dabble into it a few weeks ahead of Azumi's due date. Given the scar this left me with, I had intensified my efforts ever since. When I finally finished after half an hour, I repeated the process and subsequently implanted Aoi's right eye into Akane. It would usually take at least a week until a medic would allow someone the use of a transplanted eye. The nerve strings, even with the help of Iryo ninjutsu, were raw and brittle until they had the time to fully heal, and any premature use could hamper the healing process and increase the chances of an infection. This was an undeniable fact that wasn't helped by the anti-rejection medicamentation the recipients of transplants had to use for the rest of their lives. The medication was wholly unnecessary in their case, with them being identical twins, and another reason why I chose them for the procedure despite their admittedly young ages. Depending on the outcome of this experiment and the Mangekyou Sharingan's abilities each eye would manifest, they might have to keep an eye on their sister. Even if my theory turned out to be correct, it was formulated upon the observations made regarding one pair of Sharingan split between two people and not two pairs as was the case with them. Regardless of the outcome of my experiment, I would rather avoid burdening them with medication that would weaken their immune systems, which might have an undeniable impact on their general health and endurance, amongst other things, preventing them from fully realizing their combat capabilities down the line. Even so, it would still leave them with two injured eyes, which shouldn't be strained in the foreseeable future to prevent damaging them. Raiding Kushina's room provided the perfect solution to this problem. A solution which, as the telltale sound of a cage bunshin dispelling and the memories that came along with, informed me, was ready to be used since the ceiling array was finished being drawn. Each of my hands reached around the twins' small hips and lifted them from the ground when I stood up on my way to the center of the room. I placed Akane within the bounds of the recipient circle of the ceiling array while the currently last remaining clone of me present in the room unceremoniously threw down Fugaku into the donor one. I took a step back, moving well outside the bounds of the seal, holding onto Aoi while my clone went for the control array of the seal. It was located between the two circular transfer endpoints and activated the seal by channeling some chakra through her feet into it. The array lit up, and what looked like a yellow ethereal substance was making its way through the sealing array on the ground from Fugaku's side to the twin. It showed a remarkable resemblance to blood traversing a vein. The difference was that instead of sustaining a body with oxygen, this one transported the life force from one side to the other. It took just a few moments of the seal running at a low setting for the effects to become notable. I watched with bated breath as, in slow motion, Fugaku's hale and hearty body turned feeble. His hair turned white, and the few small wrinkles on his face multiplied and became deep gouges littering his face as the life was literally sucked out of him. He more and more resembled a raisin than a grape. On the other side, the effects weren't as pronounced. From where I was standing, all I could tell was that Akane had gained an increasingly healthy complexion. I would have to wait for this to be over before I could do a thorough examination of the twin to say more, but it seemed the seal was working as advertised. I turned my attention back to Fugaku, not wanting to miss a single second of his demise. He ultimately didn't last long, and if not for my Sharingan burning every gruesome detail to my memory, I would have been vexed at how fast it was, not giving me the time to truly savor the process. My clone went to the lifeless husk that had once been the man I had been forced to marry and sealed it away. The clone replaced it with a female roughly the same age as Fugaku and removed her eyes with surgical precision. Meanwhile, I switched out Akane with her sister, and we started the process again. Mere moments later, we had a second body that was also sealed away and had to be disposed of later, just like Fugaku and the many others who would follow him into death. I would probably resort to the use of fire, not because it was tradition for the clan to burn our dead, I couldn't care less about that, but the tinge of poetic justice it invoked was a different matter. Burning the old and decrepit and building something new, nurtured by the fertile ground provided by the dispensed ash of their bones, seemed like a fitting end to my father's legacy in more than one sense. Crouching down next to the twins, I took stock of their condition. The diagnostic scan of their bodies not only told me that their implanted eyes were fully incorporated and ready to be used, but that there were other changes. At first glance, they might seem inconsequential: improved blood circulation throughout their bodies, an increase in red blood cells and muscle fiber density, and bone hardness. For now, those changes were small, their bodies facilitating them by burning through their stored resources. I could only assume that those changes wouldn't be fully finished for another few weeks, depending on their food intake during that time frame. It was truly astonishing. Seeing these effects, it became clear that the prolonged life expectancy was only a side effect of an overall improvement of the recipient's bodily health. This would undoubtedly be reflected in their overall combat power, since those changes would ultimately help boost their endurance, speed, and chakra. It was more than I could have hoped for and made me wish, for the first time in my life, that my clan was bigger than it currently was, with more bodies to spare. My musings were interrupted when another of my clones appeared via Kamui inside the room and deposited another batch of people in a scroll containing the assets of the raided homes on the ground before dispelling immediately afterward. This was the last of my clones to successfully return from collecting clan members from their homes. Only those in the Uchiha police station and the one I left behind to blow up Naruto's living accommodations had yet to accomplish their tasks. Stimulating the eyelids of the twins with a bit of chakra ensured that they would stay open for the next few minutes, even in their unconscious state. With the final step of my preparations done, all that was left was figuring out if Tsukuyomi was up to the task. The vast experience in using genjutsu and manipulating memories I had accumulated helped a great deal in crafting the illusion. The first part of the illusion was a short fight against a faster opponent relying on barrages of countless senbon. Projectiles that were notoriously hard to make out, thereby straining their eyes while also putting them under emotional pressure with their sibling present and in need of protection, did the trick of awakening the Sharingan in both of them. Designing a scenario to awaken the Sharingan was simple enough if you had no regard for the child's well-being. It had been a common practice back in clan-era days for parents to force the issue. The clan had numerous instructional guides regarding the topic stashed away. Each method seemingly tried to outdo the other in cruelty that could be inflicted upon the children with varying success rates. It was the second part of the illusion I was anxious about. I kept the details mostly the same as what Kakashi could remember from the encounter. I only replaced Rin with the twins' mother, and then put them both into the illusion. I was careful to ensure that they then went through the events concurrently, just from different points of view. Akane was the one to accidentally kill her mother with a kunai while her sister Aoi observed it from nearby. The whole proceeding didn't even take a second. The very instant I cast Tsukuyomi, it was already over, both of the twins' eyes advancing to Mangekyou Sharingan state. The appearance of all four of them was identical to the pinwheel pattern of Obito's eyes. The activation and subsequent advancement took a lot out of both of them, leaving their bodies at the very brink of exhaustion and severely depleting their chakra. It was difficult to imagine how they would have fared before they had received Fugaku's life force, strengthening their own. It didn't bode well for the other younger girls, but that was a consideration for later. At present I was more interested in learning more about their eyes. Diving into their memories and listening to the exact moment their eyes advanced, and whispered to their subconscious what they are capable of, confirmed my theory. In addition, it became apparent with their eyes, not only possessing the same ability as Obito's, but also possessing the same distinguished pinwheel pattern, that those two things went hand in hand, and were solely dependent on the triggering conditions. This allowed someone familiar with all possible permutations to be fully aware of what they were facing with just a glance at the eyes. Unless, of course, that glance turned out to be a fatal mistake. Even eternal Mangekyou Sharingan wouldn't be exempt from this phenomenon since their pattern was a simple fusion of the two respective Mangekyou Sharingan patterns making it up. There was another interesting tidbit of information I gleaned from this. Both the twins manifested only one ability each. Akane got the ranged Kamui attack in her original left and the implanted right eye. Her sister got the intangibility touch version of Kamui in her original left and the implanted right eye, and neither could manifest a Susanoo, which I assumed could only be done with eyes belonging together. In order to prove or disprove that theory, which should help deepen my understanding of our bloodline, the twins needed their original eyes back. The process of carefully removing and retransplanting them barely took me a minute. As a result, each of the twins, once again, ended up with one eye that was in no condition to be used. Luckily, I knew how to solve that problem, and so did my clone, who correctly deduced what I was planning and anticipating my needs had prepared another two of my male kin. The only use any of them had in the Uchiha clan I envisioned, subordinate to my Naruto, laid in their eyes and the life force they could offer to strengthen those worthy. I would strip them of both until nothing remained. After my clone placed the first body stripped of his eyes into the sealing array, I activated it. The effects it had on the donor were exactly the same as Fugaku and the woman suffered before, his shriveling to a lifeless husk within mere moments. The effects on the twins compared to the first time were negligible. Their bodies visibly recovered from what I had put them through, but this time there was no immediate change in their complexion. It wasn't unexpected. There had to be a limit to the amount this seal could help a recipient already in peak physical condition. When the array shut down with the death of the donor, I went to both of them and conducted another examination of their bodies. As it turned out, receiving a second dose of life force expanded upon the changes from the first, increasing most bodily functions even further. This confirmed that the sealing effect was indeed cumulative. Unfortunately, I had no way to tell what impact the ritual had on the twins' life expectancy. It might have added 10, 20, 30, or even more years to their lives, or in the best case might have added the donor's entire lifespan as advertised. It was unlikely I would ever be given the opportunity to find out for sure, because not would I have to outlive them, but also given the danger of our profession, neither of us dying a violent death at some point was an unrealistic expectation. The only thing I could say with any certainty was that it most definitely wouldn't shorten it, and it gave them an edge, which was a more than sufficient reward for a resource that I would otherwise be squandered, since I would have killed them all anyway. With that question answered, I turned my attention back to the twins and once more dived into their memories, looking for another whisper. It took me a while to find it, as it was quieter and buried deeper than when their eyes had first advanced, even more so than whenever a Mangekyou Sharingan gets added to my collection, but it was unmistakably there. Once again, I was proven right, and each of the twins was now equipped with a pair of Mangekyou Sharingan able to perform both Kamui Jutsu and the ability to conjure Susanoo, the latter being a necessary requirement in order to gain an eternal Mangekyou Sharingan. No matter how powerful Kamui was, it wasn't worth being stuck with eyes that would eventually lose their light. The conundrum was how to proceed from here. I was reluctant to advance their Mangekyou Sharingan to eternal Mangekyou Sharingan using someone else's Mangekyou Sharingan, despite the abundance of people with Sharingan all around me whose eyes could be put toward that purpose. Something was stopping me. It wasn't the time it would take me to achieve it that was the problem, since I wasn't under any time constraints. At best, it was a soft one rather than a hard one, since it would politically hurt me to delay owning up to my deeds, and it would make negotiations about the clan's future more difficult. Other than that, and the added risk of someone escaping, either through an ability advancing their eyes might grant them or during one of the breaks I inadvertently would have to take to do so for the over 500 members of the clan, there was no logical reason not to do it. All I had was a gut feeling. No, it was more than that. Ever since I had implanted Naruto's eyes into my Susanoo, there had been a connection between us. It was faint, and without all the other eyes as a comparison, it was doubtful I would have been able to tell it was even there, to begin with. Still, for there to be some kind of link made sense. As Obito's case had made clear, a pair of Sharingan remained connected to each other even if spatially separate. So it stood to reason that since his regeneration made sure he wasn't limited to just one pair of eyes throughout his life that all his eyes were connected. His eyes were special, just like he was. I had known that from the moment I had first laid my eyes upon them. The raw power they had emanated had been beyond even my late father's eternal Mangekyou Sharingan. It was hard to imagine what they would be like should they ever evolve. So I was more than just confident they would more than suffice to preserve the twins' light, even though it would come at the price of their eyes not gaining any additional abilities, instead of the possible 5 jutsu remaining at just the current 3. Then again, it was 3 extremely powerful jutsu. Most, if not all, of them would never have unlocked them, if not for me, and perhaps something would come of this. While I had to admit the chances were slim that the twins would somehow benefit from this in the future beyond not going blind, the same couldn't be said about Naruto. After all, there were some undeniable similarities to the triggering condition of Kamui. In the grand scheme of things, if limiting all their eyes to just 3 Mangekyou Sharingan abilities instead of the possible 5 held the potential, regardless of how slim, that Naruto would profit from this in some way, I would always consider it a price more than worth paying, and would gladly do so 1,000 times over. My mind made up, I ventured over to a sleeping Naruto. After steeling myself, I began the grueling task with the help of my clone of harvesting his eyes. By the time I had collected both of his eyes and had handed them to my clone, one of his eyes had already fully regenerated, allowing me to extract the second pair without any downtime. I didn't linger next to him for long and only allowed myself to briefly caress his cheek, fearing that if I did, I wouldn't have the heart to do this, over and over again, until all of the chosen were seated with his eyes. Both my clone and I returned to back the twins with our respective bounties. Carefully prying open one of the twins' eyes each with my index and middle finger, I used a Menomina Kanushin them both. Their eyes immediately became milky, and their pupil was overlaid with a shadowy resemblance of the Mangekyou Sharingan pinwheel the jutsu originated from, displaying its use for everyone to see. Unlike Koto Amasukami, the jutsu didn't subtly manipulate the target's mind, and instead suppressed most of the conscious mind, thereby turning them into nothing more than puppets whose strings were held by the user of the jutsu. They were forced to obey every command given to them. It really shined when it came to combat applications. Being able to hijack an opponent's body with a glance was nothing to scoff at. Even though the jutsu could be dispelled, it was easier said than done. After all, there was a huge difference between disrupting the chakra of a willing ally and that of an enemy, especially if that enemy had access to nearly their full range of abilities and was constantly hurling jutsu at you. The added disregard the hijacked had for their own bodies only added to the danger. That it was most likely this jutsu which was ultimately responsible for the Kyuubi attack was only of academic interest at this point, because by the time the day was over, nobody with access to the jutsu, or the potential to awaken it, would be in any state to threaten Naruto ever again. At least it appeared that way, because with this, I had added the eyes of 2 of the 3 known users of the jutsu to my collection, and Madara had been dead for decades. Still, there was some lingering doubt. I had only been able to retrieve 1 usable eye from cousin Obito, with the other one closed from what I assumed was the use of Izanagi, the eye which had to be the one to cast a Meneminakanushi on the Kyuubi, because his other eye was only able to use Kamui. Not that it stopped me from implanting it into my Susanoo in the hopes of getting something out of it, which to this day hadn't happened, and after nearly 8 years of nothing, I doubted that would ever change. Nevertheless, with Obito's other eye having been gifted to Kakashi, it begged the question as to where he got his second eye from, and what happened to its counterpart. Quite a shame, since it prevented me from finding out who it originally belonged to. Minato must have really done a number on him if he was forced to rely on that jutsu to sacrifice what at the very least must have been a Mangekyou Sharingan, and still lost. Still, Fugaku, the only other wielder I knew of, was no longer an issue. With control over their bodies, I forced them to summon the first stage of their Susanoo and directed the chakra construct to implant a pair of Naruto's eyes into the empty eye sockets each. The whole process barely took a full minute, but when I relinquished my control over their bodies, they conked out, and their small bodies trembled uncontrollably. I didn't even have to examine them to identify the symptoms of acute chakra exhaustion. My clone didn't waste time, and went to prepare another few bodies to relieve their suffering. I, however, just stood there replaying the exact moment they reached the eternal Mangekyou Sharingan in my mind. The glimpse I caught in their eyes was not something that should have happened. From my research over the years poring over old dusty scrolls, I knew that when 2 Mangekyou Sharingan were combined to create an eternal Mangekyou Sharingan, their respective patterns merged into a new one signifying their evolution. They didn't talk about the 3 pinwheels, the tomo of the Sharingan turned into multiplying into 6 and then 3 of them spinning until they overlaid the 3 original arms and became one. I would have expected to see a 6-armed pinwheel Sharingan if I had given the eyes of one of the twins to the other in order to create one pair of eternal Mangekyou Sharingan, but that was not what happened, and even if it had, it wouldn't have explained the subsequent merger. I waited with bated breath for another transfer of life force into Aoi to be over and Akane's turn before I began my investigation. Diving into their minds, I nearly missed it. Only the thought of what the eternal Mangekyou would have turned out to be had the twins' eyes been combined lingering in my mind allowed me to notice the subtle differences in the whispers of their eyes. They didn't tell of any additional jutsu they were now capable of, but they did mirror each other's capabilities. This meant that both of their eyes were able to utilize each of the 2 Kamui jutsu, Naruto's eyes creating the exact same result I would have gotten had I combined both the twins' eyes into one. Suddenly, using his eyes didn't seem like such a bad idea. Sure, it was still a reduction in options open to the wielder with only having 3 instead of 5 jutsu. Still, considering that losing an eye, which was a real possibility in a battle, would reduce 5 to 2 and 3 to 2 made the trade-off seem was a wantonly underestimated concept. I reached for the scrolls one had taken from Kushina's study and unsealed their contents, and 2 cylindrical objects appeared. I picked up the first one and imprinted it with my blood. Object in hand, I went over to Naruto. A small incision on his thumb provided me with a few drops of blood, which I used to imprint him as the second user of the tool supposed to apply the seal to our eyes. The rest of the blood I applied to the stamp carrying the seal to ensure that only his seed would ever take hold in the womb of any Uchiha woman. For the finishing touches, I applied both seals to safeguard our bloodline to the twins. After one final examination of their bodies, in which I found no cause for concern regarding the seals, I used the first tool while looking up and applied it to both my eyes. Then I unwound my kimono to get access to my stomach and applied the second seal on top of my navel. Unlike the seal to my eye, this time I felt something, a warmth spreading throughout my lower torso that grew increasingly unpleasant. It was as if my insides had been lit on fire, curling up in the fetal position because of the pain. I couldn't stop cursing myself for my utter stupidity, overlooking the fact that I had given birth, and, despite my virginity technically intact, I was not untainted. Of course, a seal from a patriarchal society that treated women as nothing more than cattle would take issue with that. Just before the pain grew unbearable and I thought I might die, the pain stopped, and the heat in my guts disappeared as suddenly as it had begun. Righting myself, I grudgingly acknowledged that I had been lucky. This mistake could have cost me, and Naruto, everything. As the sole person standing between him and the village, I had to do better. I owed that to him and his parents. This realization made me reconsider messing with the last seal from Kushina's room before I had the chance to completely look it over. With that taken care of, the only thing left was ensuring their unquestionable loyalty to Naruto. Given that every clan indoctrinated their children to various degrees, it wouldn't take much to achieve that. A few minor tweaks to their memories here and there would suffice. Some added narrative painting Fugaku and the elders in a bad light trying to usurp me would answer the question of why they had needed to die, and we had aligned ourselves with Naruto. I also erased the unsavory memories of what I had put them through. Under normal circumstances, this would be as far as I would go, but this was not about my sensibilities. This was about Naruto's safety, and for that, there was nothing I wouldn't do, no line I wouldn't cross. This was why I tapped into Koto Amatsukami. Unlike my late father, I wasn't content with relying on some badly worded suggestion to force their compliance. Loopholes and unforeseen circumstances conflicting with the orders given were just too much of a risk. Instead, I chose to go with what my father should have used on me, even though I was glad that he hadn't, and made the twins love Naruto with everything they had. This was not entirely without danger either. Obsession had the potential to become a problem on its own. For that reason, I went to great lengths and curbed their capacity for feelings like jealousy as much as reasonable, and added loyalty towards the clan, and especially towards Naruto, in equal measure. This should prevent any unforeseen accidents, and since I had every intention to monitor those changes and adjust what I did to each individual girl as needed, I didn't expect any real problems to occur. Wiping away the sweat on my brow, I let my eyes wander around the room. 50 more to go, meaning another 50 more Tsukuyomi to trigger their eyes, another 50 more Amenaminakanushi to call forth their eyes, another 50 more uses of Koto Amatsukami, Aminoto Kodachi, and Kami Musabi to alter their minds. I had a long and exhausting night ahead of me. I was reluctant to do the same to the youngest children. The strain of a Susanoo forcefully conjured would likely be enough to potentially harm them permanently, if not outright kill them. Even in the best-case scenario, I expected a severe case of chakra exhaustion, and as a result of that for them to fall into comas. Their chakra networks and tenketsu were just not mature enough to sustain such a highly demanding jutsu. Their deaths, should they occur, would be a heavy hit given what I had planned. My plans made every single girl a valuable and rare resource, and squandering them lightly was the last thing on my mind. Nonetheless, it couldn't be helped. I had to do this now, fully aware of the risks. With our clan's strength diminished, we found ourselves in a very perilous position. Fugaku and the elders were known traitors, to the Hokage at minimum. This could mean that rather than allowing me, an associate of theirs, to stay in charge, they might decide to simply dispose of me and start over themselves and rebuild the Uchiha clan how they saw fit. This was a possibility I couldn't simply discount, but it was a course of action I was certain I could dissuade them from even considering by placing as many hurdles as possible in their way, to the point that dealing with me would be far less of a headache for them. Among other things, it meant not a single Uchiha would have unprotected eyes, ensuring that no one besides those born with them could ever make use of them. This alone would go a long way toward making us a less tempting target for their machinations. This was especially true since a woman or girl used as a breeding stock had no need for eyes, which made protecting our eyes a valid concern. Danzo, in particular, struck me as someone who wouldn't be above such methods if they furthered his goals. Then there was the fact that leaving the girls with just a Mangekyou Sharingan heavily limited the use of their eyes throughout their lifetimes, and sentencing them to a slow descent into blindness was something that left a bad taste in my mouth. The existence of a key to the seals protecting our eyes meant that it could easily be fixed at a later date, allowing me to unlock Naruto's, or anyone else's, eyes should the need arise for some intact eyes to advance a Mangekyou Sharingan to an eternal Mangekyou Sharingan. So the logical thing would have been to postpone the procedure until they were older and their bodies were able to take the strain. The problem was that I had noticed when I had gained Obito's eye, and later my father's, that the hold Koto Amatsukami had over me slipped ever so slightly in response to the power of their eyes being added to my own. Given the power held within Naruto's eyes, there was a chance that by advancing their Mangekyou Sharingan to an eternal Mangekyou Sharingan that the sudden boost to their power might weaken or remove the adjustments I had made to their minds and memories. It was a risk I simply couldn't take. My hold on them needed to be absolute. Otherwise, they could become a potential threat to my Naruto. Hopefully, by strengthening the younger girls beforehand by transferring the life force of one or two people, the worst might be avoided. The Uchiha clan, as of yesterday, had 598 members, minus my father and brother we were left with 596. Yet only 56, including myself, were of any future use to my Naruto. That left me with 540 spare bodies. If I fed the life force of 7 others to each of my 56, that would leave me with 148. It would probably be prudent to give the more talented members like Izumi and Shigure a few more to strengthen them further, perhaps even to Satsuki. She was in Naruto's class, and if I couldn't pry him out of the academy, she would be all the protection he had for most of the day. Given her mediocre talent, she would need all the help she could get to not slow him down. So, if I gave those 3 an additional 3, that left another 39 for me, and the rest I would use on Naruto. It should more than make up for what I would have put him through by the end of the night by extracting 56 pairs of eyes from him. Just imagining what heights this might allow him to reach had me lick my lips with excitement.